King, comfort of the Spirit, truth, who giver, president, full of all things, treasurer, blessings, and giver of life. Come and abide us and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good. For those who, just a little bit about Cyprus. As you know, Cyprus is in the eastern Mediterranean. It's directly south of Turkey. It's directly west of Lebanon. And it's about 200 miles from the Lebanese coast, 250 miles. It has a very, very long history, thousands and thousands and 7, 8, 10,000 years of human habitation. And it's gone through multiple empires. I don't even remember all of the various successions of empires that it was in before the advent of Christ. But it went through Syrian domination and Egyptian domination and eventually Roman domination. And then the Roman turned Byzantine. In other words, the Roman Empire turned Christian, which is really the delineation between Roman and Byzantine. And at this time, there was in Cyprus, there was always a kind of division between the ruling classes and the peasants. And the ruling classes often came from elsewhere, whereas the peasants were, let's see, is it possible to stick that up there? Cyprus did have a significant, it was visited by St. Paul and St. Barnabas, and Lazarus, who had been resurrected by Christ, eventually took refuge on Cyprus. The Jews, of course, as it says in the Gospel, had sought to kill him, and he continued to be persecuted by the Jews. And undoubtedly there was a large Jewish community there in Cyprus. So as one of the disciples of Jesus Christ, he came over and he eventually was made bishop in Cyprus, in Kition. And his relics today are in the city of Larnaca, at least the bulk of his relics, and you can go and see his tomb. There are several kind of major cities in Cyprus: Larnaca, Nicosia, or Lefkosia. That's the Greek name. Nicosia is the English name. Limassol, Paphos, the ancient name is Famagosta, and then there's various other places, Ayia, and so forth. All of these at various times were kingdoms, and in some of them, these larger cities, you can find architecture going back for 1,500, 2,000 years. There was one church that we encountered where the apse had a 6th century mosaic in it, a pre-iconoclast. But the rest of the church had been replaced by an 11th century nave, which there was a 14th century edition and a 16th century edition. So it was this huge stone church, I believe in Larnaca, yeah. And with this magnificent image. The group had two, well, back to the history. During the Roman Byzantine era, Cyprus, because it's such a crossroads with the Middle East, remained a place where there was a lot of trade going on, and it was essentially a Greek community. But Hello. But as with so many of the um, things that happened with the advent of the Crusades, the Crusaders went into Cyprus and they took over, and so there was you can kind of call it a dynasty, the Lusignan dynasty, from the 11th through the 14th or 15th century, and so of course they were French, and that brought Western Crusader and Roman Catholic influence into Cyprus in the ruling classes. The Greek peasants basically just continued on farming and doing their thing and living in these villages. And some of the villages that they created are kind of unbelievable in their layout, because they're on the sides of these mountains. You have to practically be a mountain goat to get between them. You know, these little tiny narrow roads, and some of which you can take cars through and some of which you can't, and some of which you shouldn't, undoubtedly. There was one we went to which had a funicular, so that you'd have to park way up on the main road and take this funicular down several hundred feet, and then there was a bridge across the river, and then there was a church there, and a couple other kind of village center buildings.
Do they drive on the right side or on the left side?
They drive British style.
So left side.
On the left side.
Okay.
So.
And you was driving?
Pardon?
You was driving?
Oh no. Mm-hmm. Thank God. No, that really confused me. Even in Britain, I haven't driven. I drive endless amounts in this country, but not over there.
And these villages, do they farm something on the mountain or just live there?
Yeah, actually they do farm. Down on the flats they have farms, where they can irrigate, and then they irrigate, on the sides of the hills. They do some terracing, but it's the climate is basically desert, and there's very little rain. They have huge problems with drought, and traditionally they've had huge problems with drought. With all of the centuries of being occupied and exploited, Cyprus had been earlier completely forested, had been densely forested, and it was by the time the British took over in the 1830s, I believe, there was only 5% of the land was forested, and when they left, 20% was forested. So, of course, you chop down the forest, and it changes the climate. So far as the lay of the land goes, you have along this kind of northern peninsula going out all the way in. You have a chain of mountains that's kind of very sharp. Then over in this area is another set of mountains, the Troodos Mountains, which are quite high, around 6,000 feet. And so they get snow. They try to do skiing there once in a while, but it's not quite high enough. But one of the things that all of the mountains and all of them, the rough terrain provides is essentially hiding places for these villages and monasteries, and the island is covered with monasteries. On the other side of this map, which was put together by the Archdiocese, it has a listing of the monasteries, and it's this island has like 700,000 people, at least on the Greek side, and there's probably 75 monasteries.
Yeah, but you have 3 people in one monastery.
In some, in others you have 30 and 40.
Oh.
So it's quite interesting. With the advent of the Crusades, you had the French oppressing the Greek people, and then from them the Venetians took over from the 14th to the 16th centuries, and then the Ottomans came, the Turks, and that introduced another factor in the whole Cypriot world with the Turkish domination of Cyprus, because they took the whole island and incorporated it into the Ottoman Empire. They threw out the Europeans and introduced Islam, and began sending Turkish migrants, Turkish-speaking migrants, onto Cyprus. This culminated, with the fall of with the Greek freedom from the Ottoman Empire in the 1820s. Cyprus also was freed from the Ottomans not because they threw off the Ottoman yoke, but because the Brits made a deal with the Ottomans, and so British occupation was exchanged for Muslim occupation. And today the British still have 2 very substantial air bases. Like half this peninsula is a British air base, and then there's another huge one, I've forgotten where. Anyway, we were there, and it's massive. And the United States is involved there, but eventually it became a crown colony, and the British were trying to referee the fights between the Greeks and the Turks. There were all sorts of various kinds of arrangements of the British trying to accommodate one community or another, but ultimately they mostly ended up on the side of the Turks. So the Cypriot people suffered even more. Finally, in 1974, or 1960, Cyprus was given independence and recognized as a separate country. There had been a very strong push for union with Greece as one of the Greek islands. Of course, it's kind of far away from the Aegean, but the people were identified as Greek, and you see Greek national flags all over Cyprus, which is kind of odd because it's not Greece.
But the language is Greek.
The language is Greek, and the people are ethnically Greek, but they're not but their nationality is Cypriot, Greek Cypriot. In 1974, after a number of different attempts to create some kind of a rapprochement between the 2 communities, the Turks invaded, and they took everything north, basically, of that line. And so, and they established what's called the Turkish Cypriot Republic or something like that, which is only recognized by Turkey, and is regarded by the rest of Europe as a rogue state. So, for example, if you rent a car in the Greek part of Cyprus, your insurance is voided if you go over the border. It's kind of the Turks represent 18% of the population, and yet they seized 40% of the island. And so there's negotiations going there, but unfortunately the British and the Americans have landed much more on the side of the Turks than they have on the side of the Greek Cypriots. And politically, it's a real, it's a real issue. Families were divided. There was an exchange of populations. People tremendously suffered. There were 160,000 refugees from the north of Greek Cypriots who didn't want to live in a Muslim country, and so they had to be resettled in the lower part of Cyprus. And that was a disaster. However, one thing that did happen because Cyprus became part of the EU is that it became a major tourist center, and it became a major banking center. And so there's vast amounts of East European money, and especially now Russian money, has been deposited in Cyprus, and that money has been used to raise the level of the lifestyle of the people, so that you've got, it basically looks like Southern California. Beautiful new homes, large homes, all the latest conveniences, also multi-story buildings, very Western. Typical Western. It's like Greece, only nicer. Because Greece, of course, Greece has been devastated by the West, and but Cyprus is actually doing quite well. So with that background, the main part of the group flew into the north and spent the first 3 days in the north. Out of respect for the suffering of the Cypriots, the little party that I was part of stayed in the south and didn't go over the border. The rest of the group flew in on Turkish Airlines, which was of course a couple $100 cheaper. We flew in on British Airlines, which was very nice. Well, actually it wasn't. It was kind of like just a bus. Like a stripped down version of American Airlines or United. No, really. Seriously. But so they were up in the north, and they also had the benefit of a Turkish guide who gave them quite a political line of propaganda about how they had so much freedom and in the north, and they would even let the Greeks come together on feast days to use some of these ancient churches, and the people really weren't that Islamic, and they really weren't that serious about Islam, and it was basically everything was nice. Well, instead our group went. We flew in to Larnaca, which is, I was shocked because here's this island of 700,000 people, right? It has a massive airport. Massive. And just all sorts of planes, all different countries, and then we drove up and we stayed in Nicosia, which is the capital, which is right there. Which, if you can see, is right on the division, the dividing line. In fact, the dividing line goes right through the middle of the old city. We got there on Saturday night, and the bishop, the assistant to the archbishop, met us at the hotel, and arrangements had been made for me to serve with the Archbishop of Cyprus, which was really neat, and also rather disconcerting because, and it's one thing, There's a hierarchical style liturgy, then there's a primatial hierarchical liturgy. In other words, for the primate of a church. The Church of Cyprus has been autocephalous for 1600 years.
Wow.
It was one of the earliest autocephalies within the Orthodox world. In other words, there's no account. It's not under any kind of system of accountability to Constantinople or to Antioch or to Jerusalem or anybody else. It's a fully independent hierarchy. Of course, they're under a lot of Greek influence, and their liturgical style is very Greek, which was really interesting because it's all the same and it's all different. Every detail is different, from how the vestments fit, to how they're put on, to the entire rite of the hierarchical liturgy. It has all the same basic, all the same elements, but they're put together differently. And so that was quite a challenge. And of course, it's all in Greek. For me, that wasn't so much of an issue, but because of the British control of Cyprus for so long, English is a very, very common second language. If you speak English or Russian, you're fine on Cyprus.
They have the Russian money there, right?
There's lots of Russian money. Lots and lots.
Hiding from
So we went to a parish church because they were having the blessing of their new hall. I would imagine that church probably seats actually 800 easily. It's huge. And all over the country, you see these huge, new domed Byzantine churches, and they're on tops of hills, and they stand out and they dominate the landscape. The other thing that's amazing is everywhere you go, you see churches, and they're all Orthodox churches. There are a few non-Orthodox churches, but very few, and they're not visible. Now, some of the old Orthodox churches had been Roman Catholic at one time, and the Orthodox wrested them back. Probably some of them had also been mosques at one time, and they'd been returned. First they'd been churches, and then they'd been turned into mosques, and then returned to being churches.
But don't they have this Greek style of little churches? You can find them like mushroom in it.
Yep, they have little tiny churches, and they have the huge churches.
The huge one made by Russians, I guess. No.
No.
They have the
Actually,
same
why don't I just pass these around? And they're so there's this huge cathedral, and it was packed. And from what I understand, most of the churches are packed on Sunday mornings. It's a very different feel than in Greece. In Greece, there's a tremendous amount of anti-Christian secularism. Greece has the highest abortion rate in Europe.
Greece does.
Greece, yeah.
More than France or...
More than France. And half the population is alienated from the church. 25% of Greece is Orthodox, are faithful. On Cyprus, it's like 95% of the Greek Cypriots are faithful Orthodox Christians. and they take the faith seriously. The traditions permeate their lives. It's a place that secularism has not overwhelmed, and that's an amazing thing. It's absolutely amazing. It's stepping into an authentically Orthodox culture. Russia is like maybe less than 10% active Orthodox. You know, here's 90% active Orthodox plus. No, not everybody is super pious, of course, but so there are one of the things that, of course, that dominates the life in Cyprus, in the church life, are the monasteries, and some of the monasteries are very ancient. One of them is called Stavrovouni, which is one of the most famous, and it's a very serious monastery. It's very Athonite in its form and in its rule, and it sits on the very top of a very tall mountain, and it follows the Athonite rule where women are not permitted inside the gates. So there's a beautiful little church down below, and the ladies had to wait while Simon and I went into the monastery. And at the core of the monastery, there's this magnificent cross in the Catholicon, and it's very typically Athonite, with one exception. The Catholicon dates from the 4th century, and it was established by Saint Helen, the mother of Saint Constantine the Great, who brought a piece of the true cross from Jerusalem and left it there. Stavrovouni, I think, means place of the cross, more or less. What is
True cross.
Vuna is mountain,
right? Cross mountain?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's this huge mountain, and there's switchbacks going all the way up. And the first time we went up there, we got there just after the gates closed for the afternoon siesta. And so we ended up going back, and then Simon and I went in and got this wonderful little tour and talked to the fathers. It really helps being a bishop. It opens up all sorts of doors, and everywhere you go, they give you stuff. Like almost all these books were given to me. Otherwise, they were like 10. It would be like 10 euros a piece. So we went there. We went to another monastery, and there's a larger format book, thicker format, called Macheras. And this is a monastery way back in the mountains. It's also it has the form of an Athonite monastery, but with this huge walled complex with a Catholicon in the center. But Macheras also has another feature, which is quite interesting, is that in front of the gates on the outside, there's this huge church, which has a number of the sacred relics and icons and things like that, specifically designed to serve the pilgrims who come to the monastery. Evidently below that church there's a large trapeza, and yeah, I think that one's the Macheras, yeah. And then they also have their archangeriki, which is the guest quarters, where we were nicely entertained by the fathers. These monasteries, along with another large monastery in the Troadus Mountains called Troodotisa, and there's one of these books circulating. Is also it's a very serious monastery. Some of the monasteries have signs posted "No tourists." It doesn't mean no pilgrims; it means no tourists. And what's interesting with all these monasteries, Cyprus is warm. Here we were there in November, right? And it was in the 80s, and it was humid. And so a lot of people were, well, shall we say, dressed appropriately, which meant that the monasteries provided essentially a burqa, not only for the women but also for the men. And they had, so you'd see the.
And where, was this at a specific monastery or?
Several of them. And so
It's like a long robe with foot.
Yeah, some of them didn't have hoods,
No,
but
Like a Gregorian monk.
yeah,
we're wearing them.
it was kind of like a cassock, but without all the buttons.
Right.
And so here you had people who were obviously in shorts and tank tops, but they wouldn't let him in otherwise. And the people were very respectful. We ended up spending a fair amount of time following Russian tourist buses or pilgrim buses, and we'd get out of go into the monastery, and so everybody from the Russian the Greeks would ignore you or me. They would ignore me, but the Russians would all come up for a blessing.
Wow.
And that was kind of neat.
Yeah.
That was really neat. Some of them weren't quite sure what that was about, because some of them I think were more there to be tourists than they were pilgrims. But they were there, and they were really being exposed to this integral Orthodox culture. What else? There are several other monasteries that we visited. St. Thecla, little women's monastery. Then there's this wonderful little women's monastery called St. Nicholas, which has stone buildings, and everything was new. Was complete, and it was an old monastery, but it had been completely rebuilt, and was essentially operating in memory of the new martyr Saint Philomenos. Saint Philomenos had been a priest from the village where that monastery is located, who with his brother had gone to Jerusalem. And Saint Philomenos had been the priest who had been, priest monk who had been in charge of Jacob's Well. And he was martyred by a bunch of Jewish fanatics and carved up at Jacob's Well about,
79.
It's 1979. And evidently his relics are incorrupt, and he was, and a very great veneration of him arose, and especially in his home village. And so this monastery keeps his memory. But for me that was very interesting, because I'd heard about his martyrdom in '79, which was just the year after I converted. to Orthodoxy. And I was already painting icons at the time. And I remember at the time deciding to paint an icon of Saint Philomenos, even though it was, you know, like very primitive and here we were, you know, where he was being so well venerated, and it was really nice because our little part of our group arrived early, and so we had a little more time with the nuns. The abbess came and sat with us, and then the old priest came in, and it turned out the old priest who served the monastery was her father. And it, you know, it's really kind of all in the family over there. And we had a wonderful talk. You know, one of the things I always tried to bring up, you know, topics about monastic issues or monastic spirituality. So one of the things we talked about is the relation. How do you handle a situation where you have elderly parents in a monastery, you know, for the monastics, and it was really good. And how did they handle the relationship with the families? And that was really neat because they were just totally down to earth, and basically they had their monastics call their parents, you know, once a week. You know, if their parents got elderly and they needed to be cared for, they tried to do so and take them into the monastery and care for them there. And so that was it was very human, you know, and very very real, and not, you know, not some kind of ascetic idealism that they've gone off and renounced all family and everything like that, and which doesn't work and is contrary to the gospel anyway. So that was a real really interesting thing. There's another church that we didn't get to, which was nearby there, which was carved into a cave in the side of a cliff about 60 feet up. But they did have an elevator, and they did have this long stairway up. But luckily we got there just after it had closed. So then we went driving around. There was another monastery, and this had the most off-putting signs of any of them. No tourists, no, you know, monasteries closed, on and on and on and on. So not to be dissuaded, Simon, who's the head, our host, who's the head of Friends of Mount Athos, said, "Well, let's go up and knock on the door." So he went up and knocked on the door, and figured that, well, with a metropolitan visiting, they're going to receive us anyway. Well, most of the monasteries were well kept. A lot of them were very old. Some from the Roman era, some from the Byzantine era, some of them more modern, and a lot of them combinations. But this place was brand new and immaculate and huge. It reminded me actually of one of the California missions, only not an 18th century adobe building, but a 21st century stucco, you know. And it was huge. It was The monastery enclosed the area the size of a football field. Yeah, immense. Yeah, and here it has all these signs: no tourists, monastery, and all this other stuff, and a huge parking lot. Huge parking lot. And so we went in, and they received us warmly, and we went into the church and venerate the icons of the gorgeous, and all fairly new. And then they had us sit in the guest reception area. Again, everything absolutely like eat off the floor, kind of
How many
immaculate.
monks there?
12 nuns.
For this
12 nuns.
place.
That they 12 nuns at any given time, and then they have a house in Nicosia where there are 5 nuns who take care of elderly people, the sick in the hospice, or kind of hospital, nursing home kind of thing. And so it's a community which has one aspect is very contemplative, but they also have a very active ministry within the city. And there are a couple of elders on Cyprus, both of them named Athanasios. This is Athanasios of Troodos, who is also the abbot of Troodotissa, one of these huge monasteries in the mountains. And the other is Athanasios, who is the abbot of, or who's the Archbishop of Limassol, or the Bishop of Limassol, or Metropolitan, I think. I forget what his title is. Anyway, he's, if you read Marquides' books, what is it? Anyway, there's a guy named Marquides. He was an anthropologist who from Maine, and he rediscovered his faith. His anthropology work focused on some of the shamans of the old religion of Cyprus that still kind of survives, evidently, the folk religion. I've got these books here somewhere. For the life of me, I can't remember either his first name or the name of the books.
Is he a Greek American?
He's Greek American. These are actually some of the better books on Orthodoxy. Oh, okay. One of them is Kyriakos Marquides, The Inner River. Is one book, and then oops. Anyway, well worthwhile, and you can usually find these books at like Barnes and Noble. And one of the better popularizations of Orthodoxy around, and he has this new age background, which he processed through with this elder in these books, And this elder, which in the books he has under the name of Father Maximus, is actually this Archbishop or Metropolitan Athanasius. And as a result of his ministry, his eldership, there have been many monasteries established in Cyprus under his spiritual direction. And he in turn is tied to the Holy Mountain. So this makes sense?
Are the most of the monasteries, are there a lot of people that, men and women that go to the monasteries that are not from Cyprus or Greece, that are like from other places in the world that are seeking that life? And
I don't know how many foreign members the monastery has, or monasteries there have. But yeah, I mean, there are lots of, there are visitors from all over the world. So.
do they have seminaries there as well?
Yeah, they do. There's one monastery called Kikos, which is it's also in the mountains, and there's one of the books about it, and it's this huge stone fortress monastery, and with a big conference center, and it looks like a seminary attached to it, but all these big modern dormitory style buildings. And that's probably the richest monastery on Cyprus. We went in just at the end of the day, and he took us into a monk took us into the Catholicon, which is huge and magnificent. Had us venerate the relics, and then took us into the reliquary room, which was the treasury, which is a room twice this size, with cases, glass cases, of relics enclosed in, magnificent medieval reliquaries. And it's like everybody you can ever imagine from the Greek Orthodox world from the past 2 millennia is in those reliquaries.
They are rich because of donations, or they are supported by the government, or how does it work?
I didn't ask about the financial structure. I think those monasteries probably are rich because of donations. I don't know if...
But in Greece, I know the Greece government supports...
Did. I don't think that... That's all changing now. But Cyprus is not Greece, so I'm not sure whether it's a state church kind of situation or...
What monastery was this again?
Kikos.
Kikos.
Kykkos.
Greece supports
a
lot of the patriarchates around the world, like Jerusalem, for sure, Antioch.
With the Greek government? Or?
Yeah, they'll send support.
Yeah, here's the book about Kikos.
Such big population, specifically Christians, that you said all faithful or something, how it's affect the usual life on this island, basically? Does McDonald's stop working on Wednesdays and Fridays?
They have most of the places that we went to all had fasting options. Now that doesn't mean that you had to have fasting food. That they didn't sell meat on Wednesdays and Fridays, but you certainly had the option, which is you don't have everywhere by any means,
It's called vegetarian.
well, it's vegetarian, but when you're going to a barbecue, you normally don't have vegetarian options, but in Greek food there's a lot of vegetarian, and they would ask, the waitress would ask, of course, when you're dressed like this, they kind of make a special effort, but Um, let's see. So the it was really very beautiful. And I found the monasteries extremely interesting and edifying, and I'd love to go back and experience some of those. The other aspect of the trip was a tour of the painted churches of Cyprus. And what these are is Byzantine churches, a lot of them from the 9th through the 14th century, 15th century, and then painted between the 11th and the 16th century. You can tell, you know, that if you know Byzantine iconography, you can tell what era something was painted in. There's a couple of books floating around. Actually, most of those little books are about those churches. And you know, these churches they're small. They're probably about the size of this room, for the most part. Higher, and there's usually a central dome. But what's interesting is that they've put wooden barn roofs on top of the old Byzantine roof. So instead of looking like a Byzantine church, it looks like a wooden barn. Now, it's a really interesting architecture, and God knows it probably preserved the churches because domes always leak, and that's always a mess. But there are, I think, 9 churches. Is it 9? 9 or 10 churches that are UNESCO World Heritage Sites.
Yes.
One in particular, the first one we went to see, is at a place called Asinu, which was restored by Dumbarton Oaks, and there's a comprehensive description of the church, its architecture, its history, and a very, very detailed explanation of its iconography. Now, this is like an 11th century church with 13th, 14th century wall paintings, frescoes. Some of these frescoes, the colors are so intense, and they have not been restored. And nothing has been done to the frescoes except maybe cleaned. And some of these churches, especially during the Turkish period, were used as barns. So the frescoes on the lower parts of the walls might be worn off because there were cows leaning up against them. But you know, it's some of the best of Byzantine iconography that has survived. The only problem is we were doing 4 and 5 churches a day, and it was a lot, and they kind of melded into one another. We got into the Asinu church right at sunset, so it was really beautiful, and you had to have a light on the inside anyway. But it was really dark by the time we got out, and you couldn't see anything. Some of the iconography, you know, of course, it's all kind of standard Byzantine iconographic forms. And then we went into a series of churches which had been painted from like the 11th through the 16th centuries, and so you could see a development in the iconography with progressive Western influence. So it started out with very kind of bold, rather naive Byzantine style, kind of, you know, peasant, naive, but and then there was some churches that were kind of high Paleologan Renaissance from the 14th century, which was probably the height of Byzantine iconography. And then you started seeing things like the Byzantine, you know, very kind of classical Byzantine iconography, only the bystanders were Western Crusader soldiers. In like the soldiers who were crucifying Christ were dressed up like French Crusaders. And then it developed into some very kind of Renaissance style, or Renaissance influenced, and then finally ended up as just kind of pure Western style. But, and if you can imagine, like there's this book on the Asinu Church from Dumbarton Oaks. It's like 200 pages and $200 or something. I don't know. And it's on a church that would fit inside this room. So.
You mentioned the donors, David. That's very interesting.
Oh yeah, you know,
next to the saint would be a small figure, often of women, who were the donors of that icon. We saw that quite a lot.
Yeah, and some of them, and this was also very interesting. Some of the donors were French,
yes,
or Venetian. You know, they were Westerners, but here they had donated a Greek Orthodox church. You know, and relations between the Latin Church and the Greek Church were not very warm at the time, to say the least. So that's all part of that history within that. So, do you want to? Is there anything you want to add?
Well, just the iconography was really fascinating to me, and and particularly in the church in Asinu, because I have that book and I'd studied it and was really waiting to see this church. And indeed, when we saw it in person, these colors are just amazing. They just, it's brilliant. Every inch of the walls and the dome is covered with this beautiful iconography. And I must say, I was impressed by the advanced level of the iconography that I think referred to a very deep faith and a very prominent spiritual faith behind all this. But at the same time, there were some very interesting views, and this in the Asinu Church too. One of the very popular themes in the iconography we saw often, particularly in these older churches from the 9th to the 15th, 16th century, was the Last Judgment. And some of the Last Judgment scenes were really interesting. And of course, you found, looking at it, I said to someone in the group, I said, isn't it interesting? We look at this scene of the Last Judgment and we go not to the heavenly side, but to the earthly side. Because the scenes were just so intense. I saw figures wrapped in snakes. The funniest one, though, and this was in the Asinu Church, was the scene of all the faces in rows and the teeth. Gnashing of teeth. The gnashing of teeth. And sometimes even the beams around in these narrow churches, from one side to the other, the beam would be iconographic, with a complete scene, say, of the Last Judgment. Or, of course, the scenes of the great feasts of the church, the Nativity of Christ, the Nativity of the Mother of God. Another one that was that we saw quite often that I thought was interesting was the 40 martyrs of Sebaste.
Yeah.
They appeared quite often. So there was some, you wonder what was behind that. How did they know about all this? And then the other view that we saw so often that I thought was wonderful was the Blahernica, the Mother of God from Constantinople, icon, sign. That was in almost every church. And St. Constantine and St. Helena. St. Helena brought, and of course we knew from the story of Stavrovuni monastery, how she had come so early in the 4th century. And she had a lot to do with Orthodoxy in Cyprus, I think. Because we often saw those icons in the churches too. But there was also I was very happy to see for instance, in the Asinu Church, there's no indication of this in this wonderful book by Dunbar Noakes, but we saw in the place where the altar was, that it is again the altar. There is again an altar there, and royal doors. And I asked, was he a priest, Ladega, who was, I don't know, he was wearing a cassock representing the, this was, the Asinu Church is a World Heritage Site. But I asked him about services. I'm sorry?
How old is that church?
12th century, 1105 it was built. But there are, he said, oh yes, we have liturgies, and he named about 4 or 5 feasts of the year when they do have liturgy there, and the altars, and many of them do.
Yeah.
So that is good. They're not just museums, they do have services there.
And they're also in the new, right?
I'm sorry?
They're also in the new, right? New calendar.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was a wonderful experience. I felt it was very much like being in the Holy Land in many ways. Because you feel that presence of orthodoxy. This is a really Christian country. I mean, no one has to tell you that. You just feel it. This is a Christian country. Still. So it was really wonderful.
Yeah, one of the things that we had developed a very good relationship with the assistant to the Archbishop, Bishop Gregorius, and he's quite a character.
Yes.
And he was responsible for putting this map together. On the other side, it has various tour routes that you can take, through all these various the churches and the monasteries and all of this stuff. It's all listed, and the dresses and stuff. We had lunch with the Archbishop afterwards in his palace, and he gave us a fantastic tour of the Archbishop's palace, which was built by Archbishop Macarius, which was about the times that in the early 60s. One of the things that was really sobering about being in Nicosia is and going into the old city. To the south, the city is all new and it's all modern, but you go across the moat, essentially, and into the old city, which is, the walls are like 2,000 years old, and it's these little tiny narrow streets and stuff. But then you get up to a certain point, and the streets are barricaded with oil, like oil barrels, and he drove us around, and you can still see the machine gun emplacements. And here's this beautiful, the Archbishop's palace, which has the synod meeting rooms, and which are magnificent, magnificently decorated, and museum stuff, and all the offices for the church. But the front of the palace is riddled with bullet holes. So very sobering. And then, you know, just maybe 100 feet beyond the palace, you have this wall covered with razor wire on top. So it's really a bitter thing. And I was very pleased, you know, ultimately that we did not go over to the north, because he told us that for the Greek Cypriots, they have no rights over there. They're mistreated. They're looked down upon. They're not even treated as second-class citizens. It's a really brutal thing, contrary to the propaganda that the other part of our group was fed. And so I think it's really a wonderful thing that, you know, for us to be aware of the suffering of the Greek people of Cyprus, and to pray for them.
Suffering at the hands of the church.
At the church.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Who, of course, are some of America's greatest friends. Let's see, what else?
He showed us that example of one of the old churches in the north that was just in terrible condition.
Yeah.
And what all they were able to do for it was to clean it up, and they couldn't put anything in the way of an iconography or altar, but just at least clean it up. He said we at least had to do that and be able to put a candle in it. It was really very touching to see that.
Yeah, or hang a paper icon in it.
Yeah.
You know, and maybe some flowers or something like that. It reminded me of the desolation like it was in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And of course, the same kind of persecution. Same kind of bitter persecution. So
how do you think they maintain their strong link to Orthodoxy there, where Greece hasn't been able to do that, and other countries haven't been able really to maintain like such a high level of participation in the church?
Well, I asked him that. Yeah. You know, and they really, you know, they basically think that it's because the population values it so highly. You know, Greece has been, you know, Greece got sucked into the wars in a different way than Cyprus did. You know, and then there was the strong communist movement in Greece. The communists in Cyprus were there, but they were Orthodox, and they didn't. I mean, there were a few regular communists, but for the most part, they didn't go against the church. So, you know, it's a different history, you know, in some ways, they were protected by the British, whether they liked it or not, and they didn't, to say the least. But it was it brought them Western lifestyle. I mean, the Archbishop is very concerned about secularism. While we were having coffee after the liturgy at that large parish church, after the blessing of their new gymnasium, the Archbishop was talking at the coffee with the Minister of Education, who was had finally been persuaded to let the church inject its curriculum and not to enforce any kind of, or not to foist any kind of secular agenda on the books being used in the schools. And so there's religious education in the schools, and you know, and the best religious education possible is with Yaya, otherwise known as Baba, Grandma. You know, So, and there's a lot of other stuff, and you can see. I mean, it was visually it was an incredibly rich experience. Something I would really recommend. So, let's see. For the next couple. Okay. I am around actually for about a month. I won't be in church this weekend. I'll be in Cincinnati this weekend. But we'll definitely have class on the 15th, the 22nd, the 29th, and if I can swing it, the 6th. It appears that I'll be going off to Australia on the 8th of December and back on the 31st or 30th. So we'll have that first Tuesday in December, and we can get into back into the Gospel of John for those weeks, and then you get a little break, and then
What are papers doing?
what's that?
Our thesis.
Papers.
Our thesis. You're gonna make us write a thesis.
Whenever you want, however long you want, that's fine. So Nativity for us, January 7th, will be on a Saturday, and Theophany will be on a Thursday, so that shouldn't interfere with class once we get into January. I'll get back from Australia on a Friday, and I may be conscious again by Tuesday night, January 3rd. So
It's a non-stop flight.
no, LA. We'll stop in LA.
Yeah, but then from LA, how long?
That's 6 hours from LA.
Oh.
6 hours?
To
It's 6
Australia?
hours. It's
No,
5
from
hours.
here.
6 hours to LA.
Yeah,
from
but
here.
from
And then
LA.
to Australia, how many?
From LA to Australia.
Well, that's a good. Well,
question.
well, it is because I just got the
It's
the
long.
schedule. It's a long. Okay. I just got the an email from the person in Australia who's guiding the ticket. She says, "Good morning, afternoon." Let's see. On Friday the 30th of December, I leave from the northeast coast of Australia at 6 o'clock in the morning. Go to Melbourne or Sydney. Fly from Sydney to Los Angeles, and then from Los Angeles, and I leave Sydney at 11:30 in the morning, and arrive at Los Angeles at 5:30 in the morning, on the same day.
Yeah, but how many hours do you fly?
That's
Not-
a question.
I have no idea. I don't know how to calculate it.
That's too
And-
complicated.
On the outbound flight, I leave from here. Fly from here to LA, and arrive like in the mid-afternoon, and then the time span according to the clock is like 36 hours
That's the thing.
from LA to
We go over the date line, don't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that,
Have you already been there?
no, I've never been.
have you been there?
When I came back
No.
from Japan, it was 24 hours in the air.
Really?
Wow.
Oh, wow.
And we landed in LA, and landing in LA going through customs was
Where were you
a
coming
nightmare. From Japan.
Yeah, it's wild.
I know, my husband said 3 weeks by ship from in those days?
I think it's going to be long.
Yeah.
Your feet are going to be about this big, halfway through, just being in the air that long. For some reason, your feet swell up. I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
You have to take sleeping pills.
Oh, I've got them. I've got all sorts of pills. So,
To wake up, to go to sleep.
yeah.
Something for everything.
Actually, I think it's actually about a 14-hour flight.
Yeah, I think that's.
When it comes to it, from LA to Australia, which is about the same as it is from LA or San Francisco to Moscow. It's about 14 hours. So, it's a different season down there. So any other questions, comments? It'd be really neat to do another pilgrimage to Cyprus.
Oh, it would. It really would.
You said so that some of the Greeks are suffering there. Is it when they suffer when they go to the north? Because the
Yes.
south,
Yes.
okay, is all Greek.
And well, the Greeks have suffered especially because of the, especially back in the 60s, they suffered, or
Right.
70s, because they were displaced.
Right,
But now they've completely blended in,
right.
and they still,
So I assume they're traveling for business to the north, or
well, they can go visit their relatives and things like that. But I think they've essentially lost their property as well.
yeah.
So.
If the church has been autocephalous for 1,200 years, 1,400 years, how come they don't have a patriarch?
It doesn't matter. It's not big enough to be a patriarchate. It's patriarchate means that you have essentially that you have a certain number of synods underneath. You have it has to be a large church to be a patriarchate. You can't be a little small. Constantinople is historically a patriarchate, but wouldn't qualify now. If it was, it's because it's tiny. But even Constantinople has a number of local synods underneath the patriarchate. Cyprus has one synod of a dozen bishops. So that's small. But it doesn't matter. An autocephalous church is an autocephalous church. It doesn't matter whether you call the primate a metropolitan, a patriarch, or an archbishop. So, I think Jerusalem is a patriarchate not because of its size, but because of its historical.
Go to the next question. Because you had Jerusalem, you had Antioch.
Well, Antioch is a fairly complex church.
When it became a patriarch?
Antioch's been a patriarchate. It's one of the most ancient churches.
Right.
It is the most ancient church, but it also has, it has Syria, it has Lebanon, it has, Eastern Syria, it has North America, it has South America, and all these sub-synods within it. So.
But it became a patriarch because of its historical significance before it became as complex as it is today.
Well, initially there were three ancient historical major apostolic sees: Antioch, Alexandria, and Rome. Jerusalem wasn't recognized really until the 4th century because most all of the Jews and most of the Christians had been chased out by the Romans. Constantinople wasn't founded until 325, and so it politically became a patriarchate, but but these are autocephalous churches, and so it doesn't matter what you call the primate. So. patriarch, it usually just means it's a larger, a very large church. So,
We don't have an icons of a father in our churches, right?
of who?
Of
Of the
father,
father?
father, yeah.
Technically, we're not supposed to.
Yeah, and what surprised me is that it's like the second time when I see an icon of a God of the Father.
Well, okay, that's now. That's the Ancient of Days.
Okay, well there is one here.
And there's a difference. And it looks like it's God the Father, but it's not. It's the Ancient of Days. And one of the ways you can tell is that there's the cross in the halo.
Okay.
You see the cross in the halo?
So,
That's a sign of Jesus Christ.
so that's just a Jesus Christ, but before being appearing on earth or something?
Or outside of time.
Okay. But
Now, if you go to Jordanville, you have the icon, the major icon of the monastery, including not only the portable icon, but the one on the ceiling is the old man, the kid, and the bird. You know, the father with the little boy, Jesus, sitting on his knee with the dove. No, it's an old image. It's not canonical.
for example, this one, it said the Father, the Son, and the Holy Cross.
Mm-hmm. That's a late. It's a non-canonical form.
Okay.
Technically, those are canonically forbidden in the Russian Church, but you find them all over the Orthodox world,
Okay.
including in Russia.
Mostly in Russia, I would say.
Oh, all over.
Yeah, because we need to see God, otherwise, who is He?
So, okay. It is truly meet to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, who without corruption gave us birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever, into ages of ages.
Amen.
God bless you.